My name's Amanda Bass. This afternoon's panel is entitled The Endless War on Terror, U.S. Drones and Targeted Killing. So, as many of you know, 15 years ago, George W. Bush declared the global war on terror. As Noam Chomsky and numerous others have observed, in the years since then, the global war on terror has effectively spread terror throughout many parts of the world. In 2015 alone, the United States spent upwards of $601 billion on its military and defense budget. This is more than was spent by the next 7 highest spending countries combined. A substantial portion of this money is going to funding not only the procurement of military equipment, but also funding the operations of more than 600 bases that the United States operates worldwide. U.S. forces, meanwhile, are carrying out special operations in around 150 countries, and drone strikes are raining death and destruction down upon people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Pakistan, just to name a few. In addition, this is occurring in total disregard of not only the United States Constitution, but also in complete disregard for the applicable international human rights and humanitarian laws. Meanwhile, Congress and the courts have effectively and repeatedly abdicated their duty to hold the executive branch and executive branch officials accountable for these atrocities, and instead what we see is perpetual war, as well as the use of unmanned aerial killing and surveillance machines carried out with impunity. This horrifying reality presents some real challenges to people who are engaged in anti-war opposition in the United States. How do we build an anti-war movement to challenge the fundamentally immoral and unjust actions of our government? And how do we expose and oppose in practical ways the terror that's inflicted by our government on people and communities around the world? This afternoon, we are joined by 4 panelists who are going to share with us their reflections upon these as well as other questions. Our guest is Ed Kinane. Ed has, since 2010, been jailed numerous times for civil resistance at Hancock Reaper Drone Base. He has served 2 federal prison terms for opposing the School of the Americas and has also been jailed for his nonviolent resistance in New York City and Washington, D.C., as well as in his native Syracuse. Ed's human rights activism has taken him to Latin America with Peace Brigades International, as well as Iraq with Voices in the Wilderness in 2003, and Afghanistan. You can also find his drone commentary on truthout.org. So we're going to start with Ed.
Like the phony war on drugs, the phony war on terrorism promotes economic interests, serves political agendas, entrenches militarism. Neither war reduces drug use or violence, nor are they designed to. Terrorism, past and present, pervades the U.S. psyche and economy. Terrorism, so-called, in the fear thereof, blunts our minds, shrinks our hearts. This contrived national obsession gives the Pentagon and the NSA/Homeland Security their ever-expanding powers. It tightens their grip. It swells their coffers. Their bloated budgets, like the Congress that funds them, march to corporate drummers. Since World War II, terrorism/militarism has been exceedingly profitable. for the so-called defense industry. Think, for example, of Lockheed Martin. U.S. corporations thrive on the export of weapons and weapon systems. Peace kills the war economy. Why seek peace? The high-tech war industry, the U.S. economy's warped backbone, enriches the rich, deprives the poor. Military spending sucks life out of civil society. That military spree, barely monitored, finances death-dealing projects. These profit-intensive projects preempt job-intensive, life-serving ones. Pentagon budgets guarantee grossly underfunded housing, schooling, health, and infrastructure development. Along with the nuke industry, now in its 8th decade, the perpetuated terrorism-militarism nexus drives economic disparity, propping up this nation's class structure. Patriots and propagandists endlessly invoke, but seldom define, terrorism. So now I'll do the unusual. I'll define terrorism. Terrorism is the use or threat of violence against civilians for military, political, or economic ends. There's a lot packed in there, so let me repeat that. Terrorism is the use or threat of violence against civilians for military, political, or economic ends. This definition cuts to the chase, cuts through the layers of jingoism and obfuscation, perpetuated by patriots and propagandists. The definition is 4 corollaries, well, at least 4. First, contrary to U.S. mainstream media usage, terrorists aren't inevitably people of color, nor are they primarily swarthy or sallow. Here in the U.S., the term terrorism somehow applies only to what they, i.e., non-whites, do, not to what whites or the U.S. does. Second, in the 20th and 21st centuries, it's fascism and capitalism that have colonized the skies. Hence, most terrorism has been aerial. V-2 rockets, cruise missiles, Hellfire missiles, napalm, white phosphorus, cluster bombs, depleted uranium, weaponized drones. Third, most terrorism is wholesale, not retail. Most is state terrorism. Most terrorism is perpetrated by uniformed military. In these centuries, most war casualties, in their tens of millions, are civilian. Last, since at least August 6, 1945, the Pentagon has been the world's most relentless single purveyor of terrorism. Bottom line, the so-called war on terror is a racist war, a war for hegemony, a war for profit. It's a war its perpetrators and its perpetuators have no desire to see end. Terror is nothing new. It's built into this nation's DNA. Consider the continent-wide armed robbery of indigenous lands. Thanks to their higher-tech weaponry, European invaders ethnically cleansed Native Americans, mostly non-combatants. Like our counterparts in Israel and other colonial settler states, U.S. Americans militarily occupy stolen land. Yes, we are occupiers. And by a curious inversion or dialectic, now it is U.S. Americans who are finding ourselves occupied. Let me repeat that notion. It's U.S. Americans who are finding ourselves occupied. The occupation is so incremental, so normalized, it's barely visible to us. If the U.S. is occupied notion seems outlandish, consider the following. Why was the interstate highway system built to military specification by a general? Or why does the NSA so comprehensively monitor our phones and email? Or why is every effort made to keep the U.S. people distracted and dumbed down? Or why does the judiciary neglect the First Amendment? And why, despite Article 6 of the Constitution, does the judiciary ignore international law, much as Southern judges ignored lynching? Or why are the police so heavily armed and drilled in military shoot-to-kill tactics? Or why does the U.S. have such a vast prison system? Or why do military bases, in all their redundancy, proliferate throughout the land? Or, and this brings us directly back to today's panel, why are surveillance and weaponized drones so deadly overseas, increasingly flying over the U.S.? Now, further regarding our national DNA, consider the centuries-long wholesale abduction and displacement of Africans, robbing them of their labor, liberty, languages, their dignity, and their offspring. Ask, how did such a regime last so long? Without a whip at her back, a noose around his neck, no human endures such rape and servitude. See the film 12 Years a Slave. That terror regime, in full force, lives on today with mass incarceration and with what author Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. Police assassinating young black men channel Ku Klux Klan castration. Both are seldom prosecuted. Note the enduring intersection of impunity and racism. We've been conditioned to believe terrorism is violence perpetrated by the other, the non-white other. Blind to the origins of white supremacy and privilege, we are the legatees of our previous and ongoing terrorisms. Only when terrorism is defined do we see manifest destiny and slavery for what they were. Only when terrorism is defined do we see that today's war on terrorism for what it is, a war of, for, and by terrorism. Today's so-called war on terrorism, in quotation marks, are a must, features aerial bombing of tribal people and people of color, who can barely shoot back. The Anglosphere globalizing its centuries-long terror track. Since August 6, 1945, the world has been chilled by U.S. nuclear blackmail. Since the grotesquely one-sided war on Vietnam, and since the 2003 shock and awe terror attacks on Baghdad, the world knows it resists the imperium at its peril. The world knows the U.S. mostly and most readily targets people of color, whether Japanese, Southeast Asian, West Asian, or American. The dark-skinned world waits defiantly, wondering who will be next. Aerial terror can't neutralize, but it does provoke non-state resistance. A resistance sporadically erupting as terrorism. How convenient for the propagandists. The hunter-killer MQ-9 Reaper drone and his cowardly ilk seem for now to be just the thing for taking out the so-called bad guys. However, for each bad guy assassinated, many civilians are killed or maimed. More are recruited to resist. Not smart. While drones may be tactically clever, recruiting your enemy is strategically stupid. Unless, of course, you profit from keeping the pot boiling. Up our way in central New York, the local mainstream media normalizes the hunter-killer Reaper drone, remotely piloted from Hancock Air Force Base on the outskirts of Syracuse, my hometown. The Reaper, a former commandant, Hancock commandant, boasts, operates over Afghanistan 24/7. These robots are deployed to kill with impunity. The media downplay, if not ignore, drone war illegality, its evasion of due process, its violating others' sovereignty, and the government lies surrounding its terror. The media sanitizes Reaper transgression against human bodies and human rights. The media ignore Reaper indecency, Reaper cowardice. The Syracuse Post-Standard ignores the backstory behind any blowback, always called terrorism, of those avenging and resisting U.S. aggression. Further, perhaps sensing instinctively what a boon to business drones and the arms races are, the Post ignores the deadly prospect of weaponized drone proliferation. U.S. media has little to say about drone collateral damage, incinerating and dismembering women and children and other non-combatants, whether within or beyond so-called legal war zones. But our local media surely typify U.S. mainstream media. So let me ask you all, how many in this room heard much about the killing of 150 unknown human beings by U.S. drones and aircraft, manned aircraft, on a single day this past March? I mean, Somalia is a desperately poor nation, tribal nation, we're not even at war with. Yet we killed 150 people. The New York Times mentioned it, but it didn't rate even a blip in our local paper. The December 17th Syracuse Post-Standard reported that the Reaper is now actually flying, not just being remotely controlled, as it had been for several years, out of Hancock Air Force Base and from the Syracuse Civilian International Airport. It was a page one story festooned with color photos, and it's headlined, "Reaper Drones Makes History in Syracuse." With no pretense to journalistic balance, such stories fail to note that since 2010, our grassroots group, Upstate Drone Action, has been continually protesting the Hancock Reaper and its operating unit, the 174th Attack Wing of the New York State National Guard. The increasingly militarized local police, at Hancock's bidding, arrest us as we block Hancock's main gate and exercise our First Amendment right to petition the government for redress of grievance. Maximum fines and multiple incarcerations ensue. But the Post Standard doesn't acknowledge such erosion of civil liberty, nor does it investigate or even mention our allegations of Hancock war crime. Further, the Post has been eerily silent about the role that domestic drones are beginning to play in policing and intimidating dissidents and minorities. Like the 1950s Atoms for Peace hype, masking the dark side of the then emerging nuclear industry, mainstream media downplay the drone dark side. The Post, it seems, doesn't want to jinx upstate New York's becoming the Silicon Valley of an emerging domestic drone money machine. Over the next several years, Governor Cuomo will be subsidizing that industry with tens of millions of taxpayer dollars. What does domestic drone development and deployment have to do with terrorism? Plenty. Like the government-subsidized nuclear industry, the domestic drone industry, again think Lockheed Martin, will maintain the facilities, research, engineering expertise, skilled labor, and operators, i.e. the industrial base that the Pentagon draws on for its terror wars. As long as perpetual war keeps yielding corporate profit, state terrorism will keep making history. Thank you. I just want to throw in a plug for a book by Jeremy Scahill, The Assassination Complex. It just came out like about a week ago, so keep your eyes open for it.
Our guest is Shelby Sullivan-Bennis. Shelby is an attorney with Reprieve US, a nonprofit that focuses its litigation and advocacy efforts on extreme human rights abuses perpetuated by powerful governments. Working on Reprieve's Abuses in Counterterrorism team, Shelby works on cases challenging the U.S. government's programs of torture, indefinite detention, and targeted killing.
Hi, I'm Shelby. I work for Reprieve US, which is an international NGO that focuses on basically the greatest injustices that we see by those in power. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit, so bear with me. So we have offices in London, Pakistan, Yemen, although they've since temporarily closed since all the violence has resurged in the last year or so. Oh, thank you. And satellite offices in the Netherlands and a few other places. But what we're doing primarily is investigating and litigating as well as we can. The drone war is what I'm focused on. So we also do death penalty cases in countries like Pakistan, which are killing people by the dozens daily for terrorism crimes predominantly, but in a lot of cases drug crimes. So with my branch, we essentially try to bring the voices of the victims in Pakistan and Yemen, particularly because they're non-war zones. We try to bring their voices to the United States, to the communities that, as we see it, are able to control the policy and raise their profiles in the courts and from there in the media. And our challenges are many. In the first case, getting to clients has been more and more difficult since the violence in Yemen has increased. But there's one particular story of a strike in 2012 that we were able to bring to court in DC a few years ago. So it's the case of Faisal bin Ali Jabber, who's one of my favorite clients. You're not supposed to have favorites, but I do. And his family was struck and killed in a 2012 drone strike. So this is actually before the civil unrest got to the degree that it is now. The United States was not at war with Yemen during that time. And we killed his brother-in-law and his nephew. The brother-in-law, as fate would have it, was an anti-Al-Qaeda imam, So on the Friday before he died on a Monday, he was preaching against Al Qaeda to his community. He felt that as an educated person, he had a master's degree in linguistics and taught different languages at local schools, that it was his responsibility to fight back against the word of Al Qaeda, saying that it was not what Islam was about, you know. So that was his Friday night sermon, and then the following Sunday, a few unknown young men came to his village and were asking, "Where is this man?" No one knew them. They were 16, 17, judging by the photos of their decapitated bodies. We suspect that those were the targeted individuals. Those three men, being from out of town, had to travel through several checkpoints in order to get to my client and his family, because of where they are in Yemen and how remote their village is. That'll become relevant a little later, but so they're traveling through a few military checkpoints, because that's the way that area of Yemen is set up. It's in the federally administered tribal areas. So he finally, the three young men were finally able to locate the imam, and the imam agreed to meet them, not knowing what they wanted or who they were, and he took along his son, who is the local traffic cop, for protection. And this is a village where there were only 2 policemen. So he goes along. They meet. They drive and meet, and where they actually ended up meeting was 2.5 kilometers from a Yemeni military base. This will also become relevant later on. So once they meet, moments afterwards, some of the people hadn't even gotten out of the cars. They're struck by 2 U.S. drone strikes. They all died instantly. Local buildings were dilapidated. The car was completely gone. Because the family ended up finding us later, have footage, video, picture footage. It's definitely the most disturbing thing I've ever seen of that wreckage. I mention all the checkpoints and the military bases because under international law, if you are taking military action in a non-war zone, the only legal way to do so is if your targets cannot be captured and they pose an imminent threat to American interests. So the argument is, this was not a war zone. What is the proof, if any, that these three unknown men posed an imminent threat? And they certainly were not unable to capture because of the multiple checkpoints that they had to enter before they encountered the civilians, because when they finally were struck, they were only 2.5 kilometers from a military base. So all this to say sort of underlies what we at Reprieve, and I'm sure many others agree, is a trending policy of the United States government in combating terrorism, which I will always put in quotations for the reasons that Ed outlined, to kill instead of capture. So our general theory, and what a few of the members of Reprieve have been told quietly by members of the White House Council, is that they got into so much trouble detaining people. We have clients in Guantanamo Bay, we had clients in Bagram, then now they're just killing them. There is an argument that Yemen was a war zone because the world is a war zone, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with hearing under the authorization for the use of military force. That is the only legal precedent that the government cites in defense of their action. The authorization for the use of military force, which was written in 2001, during which time Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula did not exist. That law is specifically written for Al-Qaeda affiliates who had something to do with the 9/11 bombings, essentially. So there are many different arguments as to why that could not cover even active terrorists in Yemen in 2012, because they were not part of Al-Qaeda. They were part of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula because they were not posing an imminent threat. and because they could have been captured. So all these sound like really good arguments to me, and to those of a like mind, and they fail every single time in court because the legal precedent in the United States is against us. By which I mean it was written by those in power, for those in power, it continues to serve those in power. And therefore, when we brought Faisal's family's case to court, it was kicked out on the grounds that the decision to make a drone strike is a political question and that the court does not have justiciable standards by which to measure whether or not a strike should have been taken. That is a military decision, that the president is in charge of the military, that it is his decision, it is unreviewable. So in pressing these cases forward, we understand the mountains ahead of us, essentially, and we are just very blatantly doing it to raise awareness. We don't necessarily expect to win unless we should get a judge that is so divorced from the executive, which theoretically could happen, and I would love, that he doesn't continue with this, that he's willing to overturn that precedent and allow for there to be at least a discovery period where we're able to ask questions like, okay, fine, we'll assume that those 3 unknown men were actually Al-Qaeda, that they were posing an imminent threat, all that. Now prove to us that you couldn't capture them. And prove to us that it was an imminent threat, actually, that they were actively plotting to do something with our Imam, who we doubt would be very helpful. So we've tried to bring cases in other countries which have had varying degrees of success. I think especially Europe, which is where our main office is located, is able to raise a lot of awareness in terms of many human rights issues, like even on the death penalty. The UK doesn't have the death penalty, so so basically leveraging that in terms of public opinion and saying, look, these people think it's awful. How does the U.S. think? Every time there's a European Human Rights Convention mandate, our opinion is that that affects the American consciousness, and that our objective is always to affect the American consciousness. So when we brought Faisal's case, or actually it was another case that came to the UK courts, Noor Khan, it was more well received than Faisal's. The judge said that it was an extremely disturbing case, that it implicated, really dire things for the executive. The allegation is, of course, that the UK was sharing intelligence information with the United States in their drone programs generally. But the court still would not rule because that would have dire implications for their relationship with the United States government. So there's actually something in their law, and there is in ours too, that if a judicial action negatively impinges a relationship with another country, that is sort of like a foreign relations problem. The court's not allowed to touch it. So all that to say, I don't mean to depress with the prospects of success. I actually think our prospects are quite good because as the years go on, more and more people are aware of the fact that this is happening. More and more people, as technology increases, are able to communicate with those on the ground who are seeing these things. If you think about cell phone, video cameras, that's where we got our video footage from. We didn't send in a troupe of professional photographers. Though we are becoming more connected, and that in so doing, we will become more active, and we will together make it end. How that will happen, I'm not entirely sure. I happen to be a fan of support in numbers, of activism, of writing senators. So that is generally what Reprieve does, and I will stop there.
Thanks, Shelby. Our third panelist is Nick Modern. Nick served in Vietnam in the Navy between 1962 and 1963. He graduated from the Columbia School of Journalism, reported for is it Providence? A journal and evening bulletin, researched and wrote for the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, lobbied for Bread for the World, and organized speaking tours on the U.S. involvement in Africa for Mary Knoll Fathers and Brothers. Nick is the author of Suffering Strong, reporting on his experiences in Africa, and is the coordinator of NoDrones.com's Information and Organizing Center. His articles have also appeared on truthout.org.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take off my shirt now because we're shifting into a totally action mode, and I have to reveal my Veterans for Peace Out on the Street t-shirt that I got from guys out in San Diego who also have a drone model. I'm going to try to be brief because I want to leave time for conversation. I want to say at the outset that I hope that everything that happens here today will cause people to actually act and to make plans with each other and to cooperate, to act to stop drone killing. Now, in terms of action, the first thing I wanted to mention, and we do definitely need help with this, is that Deborah from World Can't Wait and I and a man named Bob Smith in Philadelphia with Brandywine Peace Community, and Marge Van Cleef in Philadelphia, who is with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, are putting together plans right now for anti-war and anti-drone presence at the Democratic National Convention, which will be occurring July 25th through the 28th. And we will have large models of the Reaper drone down there, probably at least 3, maybe 5, depending on the numbers of people we can get, to help us take them in the street. We're hoping to make death masks, maybe as many as 100, that will be placed in different, I guess you'd say, surprising places in the city where people will find them, and on the back there'll be information about our wars, about the costs. We're hoping to have these lighted signs from the Light Brigade that'll be out at night, and maybe some other things too that we have in mind. Shifting into another part of action, I just want to speak very briefly about messaging around drones. And I think that Ed touched on this, but I'd like to put forward that any education that we undertake on drones have to be put in the context of the maintenance and expansion of the American empire. In the anti-war movement, empire is very little mentioned, I think, in terms of what people are told on the street. And it's a very interesting thing because at the time of Malcolm X's death, the time of Martin Luther King's death, they were just beginning to make the international connections and to show how the conditions of African Americans are the flip side of colonialism in other countries, and the violence used to maintain those controls on behalf of corporations that we have now, corporations that are in fact it's a refinement of plantations that existed 500 years ago when the United States was founded in Virginia, I guess you could say. So it's very important, I think, to say, well, are the drone strikes successful? The measure of success would be to cut down on the amount of violence, to cut down on the number of people wanting to do harm to people in the United States. Another measure would be, do we feel safer? But the drone strikes, the drone attacks, was really what they should be called, are a total failure on the measures that the government presents to us as for the reasoning behind this. So in our messaging, I think it might be good to explore the idea of the drones actually intending to be used to sow chaos in these poorer countries where people in those countries like Yemen could not organize effectively a government to resist empire or colonialism. And if you look where drones are being used now, these are all countries that have become what the U.S. likes to call failed states. And when the drone attacks separate out different factions, different groups, different tribes, they're used in a way very often that set one group against the other. So it makes the possibility of unity within these countries, where in Iraq, for example, a unified Iraqi government would probably want to nationalize the oil wealth again, the way it was under Saddam Hussein. So in terms of strategy and the advancement of empire, the drone is a very useful tool in disruption and dismantling of civil society and government. So I think we could look around and say, from the standpoint of the advancement of empire, the drone is a great success and is being expanded in its use. Now, that's something that I think, in terms of, the common press coverage of this, is something that never really is analyzed as to what practically is really going on. So in terms of, our task as people concerned about this and wanting to put a stop to it, I think that we have to look beyond protest, not to say we shouldn't protest, but to look beyond it into how are we going to deeply educate people in this country to overcome 500 years of propaganda as to the purposes of the American enterprise. And so if we say, well, then, gee, where do we start? I think that it's really important to look at how this empire building relates to so many other things. Climate change, the advancement of, in so many parts of the world, the oil industry at gunpoint. These are all things that are very deeply connected, and you cannot, in my opinion, address climate change usefully without addressing empire. So there are ways, I think, that if we really can think through it, we can make connections that make sense to people. You can't, stop police killings in this country completely until you educate people into how we treat people in other countries affects how we treat people here, the way Ed was talking about it. So here's some specific things that I don't think we've done very much, but can be looked at to engage people in our communities who may be educators, they may not be protesters. They may be people who are very social and not liking confrontation. But nevertheless, one of the things I think in almost, upstate New York and many places, there are factories of the arms industry. And so I've been giving a lot of thought about how can we reach out to people who are in the arms industry, as not blaming and shaming them, but saying these are our fellow inmates. And so how do we reach and address them about what they're involved with? How do we engage their conscience? Now, there's a very interesting article that's in a book I recommend to you called Over There. And this article is by a woman who's actually from Syracuse, I believe. Her name is Robin Riley, and she has done interviews with women working in the military industries in northern New York State. And what her interviews reveal is that the different elements of conditioning that people go through and that women go through so that they can emotionally separate themselves from what they're being called on to do. And so a challenge would be, how do you open up channels to talk with people about that? And Robin Riley is at the LGBT and Women's Studies Department of Syracuse University. So she might be someone to talk to about that. Another thing I would suggest is visiting local television stations and newspapers, asking them for a certain type of coverage that you want about drones. ABC affiliates and various, NBC affiliates, they have a right to make demands of the network about coverage that you want. So you go and talk to them, put your meeting up on social media, tell what happened, ask for them for follow-up, and you can, I think, do this with newspapers. I used to work for a fairly decent paper, and I know that editors would entertain meetings with people in the public, and it's something to me that is an ongoing process of monitoring and being involved with those editors, not necessarily with signs outside their door, but say every 2 months, every quarter, we're going to meet with you and we're going to discuss what is the coverage that is needed here, because we have a huge problem of public information. Another plan that I thought about was actually leafleting at local schools and churches before a protest happens. If you're going to do civil disobedience or civil resistance, if you're going to just be picketing, to explain to people in the community why it is, when you see it in the newspaper, that this is happening. For young people at schools, particularly high schools, they're very often curious about, what the hell are they doing, and people can be engaged, I think, at that age in things like this. But I think there's a huge gap existing now between protest and general public information and awareness of the purposes of protest. And finally, I'm more and more interested in the idea of serial occupations and arrests at the offices of members of Congress, because demands must be made of Congress, and I agree about writing letters, but I also think that if groups can organize themselves to say over the next 6 or 12 months, we're going to go and on these and these and these occasions, try to get a response, get action. If we don't, then we get arrested. And so the people in the Congress, they'll just get used to, this is going to happen, and I don't think they're going to like it. So those are actions that I think might be something that we could think about, because I think most people realize that so far we're not getting anywhere that we need to get, and that we have to think about different ways of going about these problems. Thanks very much.
Our fourth guest is Deborah Sweet, the director of World Can't Wait. World Can't Wait was initiated in 2005 with the goal of driving out the Bush administration's regime and reversing the direction that it took when it launched the global war on terror. World Can't Wait is continuously engaged in efforts to stop the crimes carried out by the U.S. government. Deborah worked with abortion providers for 25 years, organizing community support and helping withstand anti-abortion violence. Since the age of 19, when she confronted Nixon in a face-to-face event and demanded that he stop the war in Vietnam, she has been a leader in the opposition to U.S. wars as well as U.S. invasions.
Okay, so Nick and I didn't plan this, but I wore my special t-shirt because I'm afraid it might be one of the last times I can wear it. Is it really okay if Obama does it? Okay, this is 2016. World Can't Wait made these in 2009, in January of 2000, maybe April of 2009. And it's got a whole list of the crimes of the government on the back. We had a very hard time selling these t-shirts in 2009. Because why? People were in denial. We had 3 reactions about Obama. First, Obama would never do that. He wouldn't do that. He's for peace. The second reaction was, well, he's just going to say that. But he's really going to do something different. And here was the most disturbing reaction. The third reaction was, if Obama's going to do it, it probably needs to be done. He's our guy. Oh, there went the anti-war movement. There was an anti-war movement under Bush for a minute before the invasion started, right? But, you go to the left forum these days and you talk about targeted killing in Guantanamo, and most people are talking about and thinking about something else at the left forum. I'm not saying the people in this country aren't thinking about it, and I'm not being negative about people, but it's the furthest thing from people's minds. And yet, it's really the big motivating factor of what is keeping this empire going. This empire, and it is not only the military-industrial complex. There's an empire here that runs on the exploitation of the rest of the world. This huge global production system that has happened in the last 25 years, particularly since the Soviet Union fell, is only in place because of the US military being spread all over the world. We're trying to figure out how many bases there are. The estimates are between 800 and 1,200 US bases, but it's all secret. So how would we know? And we're living in this period where Obama, and I don't mean Obama, Barack Obama, I mean that this is where the US ruling class has gone at this point, to a system, you know, that Jeremy Scahill explains really simply. Find, fix, and finish. Find the target, fix on it, and what's finish? Blow it into nothing. And the reason this book, I think, is really quite interesting and educational at this point, it's essentially the drone papers that went up on The Intercept in October in a book form, and therefore for some of us old school people it's more accessible. But he's really explaining that, you know, none of this is accidental. Here is the executive all the way up, the whole chain of command meeting every Tuesday or every other Tuesday, or at any rate, having a system in place to pick specific targets, to strategize whole countries. You know, now this is 7 countries where targeted killing is in use. Not just Iraq and Afghanistan, but Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan being, you know, a long target of a CIA drone campaign. Yeah, and there's a lot of places we don't know about. The new, yeah, so the new form of U.S. war at the moment is not mainly occupation, but it is secret ops that really are probably much more rampant than anyone knows about. Some of us were this morning with Military Families Speak Out, who just presented, you know, the wrenching stories of their family members who have killed themselves since being in these occupations. And that is bad enough. You know, worse, that probably 2 million other human beings from other countries who are not Americans have been killed in these occupations. But then we were talking about the fact that of the drone operators, and you guys put together a whole program in April in Las Vegas, bringing some of the dissident drone operators who have been exposing the fact that not only are they being forced to lose their humanity and suffering grievous moral injury, but the rate of PTSD for drone operators is probably demonstrably higher than for the members of the military who were actually on the ground shooting, because they are 18 inches or 2 feet from the killing. And they are being put systematically in situations where they can't possibly know whether the targets they're fixing on are actually people who have ever carried out anything in terms of military action against the US government. This is what people in this country do not know, just have no idea about. They're going after the bad guys. Well, first of all, who defined them as the bad guys? Reprieve and other groups have really shown us that military-age males are the bad guys in whole countries. They're defined as targets because they're military-age males. And if they're killed, Jeremy Scahill says, if they can't demonstrably be shown to have been innocent, then they're called EKIA, enemy killed in action. So what we're hearing in reports on the targeted killing, we killed a bunch of enemies. But this is just definitional. This does not speak to the real human beings who are being killed. They're targeting people off SIM cards. SIM cards can go anywhere. They might not be with the original person who had the phone or you thought had the phone. This is how people are dying. And this is really a systematic outrage that is carried out in the 500-year history of empire. And I just wanted to say that we do have a real mission here of helping people to understand that in the last 15 years, the war zone has been essentially defined as anywhere, including, as Ed mentioned, within the United States. This is the problem that we were talking about yesterday when we held a panel about Guantanamo. A lot of people think Guantanamo, this is all getting better because you had 779 prisoners. There's only 80 left. Isn't this, 80% better? No. It's incrementally worse every day because the longer this goes on that you have people being held in indefinite detention, the more outrageous this is. And now they're talking about moving them to U.S. federal prisons, where we would have, for the first time, legally, presumably, indefinite detention within the U.S. prison system, where you're having people held without charges. So this is all of a piece, a war for empire that really has to be massively opposed. And I'm glad that Nick mentioned the Democratic convention. We're going to be at the Republican convention as well. That whoever wins, it's already a done deal. Not only Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders says, essentially the drone war is fine, presuming, and he does presume, that Obama's carrying out this with legal authority, which has never really been tested. We've never been able to, on a legal basis, really have this tested in a U.S. federal court, much less the court of public opinion, much less the international courts. So we really have a challenge here on our hands. Find, fix, and finish, I think could be really a method that we use. Let's find what the actual problem is. It's a whole system here. It is a system of capitalism, imperialism that has got an empire around the world. Fix, let's look at the problems that we can fix people's attention on. And a lot of that has to do with the moral issues of us living in the country with the biggest military ever, the only one who's used nuclear weapons. I just got to say one more thing about Obama. Come on, he goes to Hiroshima, and what does he do? Does he apologize? We are sorry. We're the only ones who ever used a nuclear weapon. Hell no. He's going there with the intention of a better military alliance with Japan and as a threat to China. That's why he went there. It has nothing to do with justice for the people who have been suffering all these years. And then he goes where? Vietnam. God damn it. He goes to Cam Ranh Bay, where the U.S. troops operated from and killed so many people. And does he say, we're sorry we invaded you and killed 2 or 3 million of your people? No. He says, we're going to sell you weapons, but what we want in exchange is we want access to Kamran Bay. Why? To threaten China and the rest of the world. This is really outrageous. And if we are going to make an impact, yes, we do have to go to the schools. And we need a lot more veterans and speakers and teachers and professors. I see a professor in the room whose class we have spoken in. Thank you very much. But your school has ROTC, right? Your college has ROTC. New York campuses at CUNY have ROTC. City has ROTC. High schools, Reserve Officer Training Corps, and the mission of the U.S. military right now is to get more officers of color, multilingual, multi-gendered, shall we say, officers who can speak various languages and run these wars, not necessarily of occupation, but maybe in the future. So we have a lot of things before us, and I really want to thank you guys for coming out, and let's turn it back over to Amanda. I also wanted to thank and introduce Amanda Bass, who introduced the panel at the beginning. Amanda was here at the Left Forum last year talking about drones. Why? Because she led a campaign at the NYU Law School against Harold Koh, K-O-H, an Obama acolyte who came to teach there and is a big fan of drone war and targeted killing. And this is how we got to know Amanda.
About those autonomous drones that are in development. They sound like a wonderful way to erase accountability for killings and assassinations and terrorism. And that may be one of the underlying reasons why they are under development.
I could speak briefly to the Al-Qaeda question. There is an Al-Qaeda, there's a Taliban, there's an ISIS. All of this we can trace very carefully and closely to response to what the U.S. did in the 90s and the 80s. There was funding of the predecessors of Islamic fundamentalist groups because what did the U.S. think? We're going to bring down the Soviet Union because we'll get these Muslim terrorists, and they had no problem with pouring a lot of money into Afghanistan and other places. There's and everything that they have done with these occupations has actually grown the basis for ISIS, for instance. I believe it was Osama bin Laden who said in 1998, if you remove the bases from Saudi Arabia, we're going to back off. And what did the U.S. do? They spread the bases. They penetrated much more deeply into the whole region and therefore precipitated a situation where, unfortunately, in my opinion, where you might have had communists, real communists, fighting against what the U.S. was doing 30 and 40 years ago. Now the only option that seems to be available to people is this right-wing fascist Islamic fundamentalist response, which uses terrorism and is no good at all. So it's really incumbent upon us in the U.S. to be showing to people in that whole region of the world that there is a section of people in these countries, in the imperialist countries, who does not want to occupy you, who does not want to own the Middle East, who does not want that oil. We want to get off oil altogether, for God's sakes.
Yeah, I think your question is really good in identifying what people in this country see as frightening organizations. But I think there would be a good argument that actually these frightening organizations are sustained in many ways by the United States for their own purposes in terms of dismantling civil society, the thing I was talking about before. Now, on the internet, just yesterday, there was the report of this mullah who was killed in Pakistan, who was supposed to be the head of the Taliban. And if you read through the story, you see that there are people who say this man was actually very moderate. And he might have been somebody who was wanting to work out something. So the United States identifying him as a danger, in my mind, would be he was a danger to a long-term plan that we had in that region to try to keep it destabilized, as they say, which is to say, filled with brutal, random behavior by warring factions. There's a book called No Good Men Among the Living. And if you read that carefully, you understand the cesspool of brutality and criminality that the United States has continually been striving to maintain in Afghanistan, and how there's a great deal of study going into who are the people who are in conflict and how do we manipulate those conflicts. Because at the same time this is happening, the United States Department of Defense created something for Iraq and then in Afghanistan. There's a RAND report about this organization. It's a task force on business and stability. And the task force purpose was and is to reach out to business people, whomever, in Afghanistan and Iraq, make connections between them and international corporations so that the mining, for example, of Afghanistan can go on at the very same time the war is going on. Honeywell Corporation, I've done some study on that, last year they announced we're building portable oil refineries so that companies can refine crude oil in the midst of war zones. So business can carry forward at the same time people are being systematically slaughtered. So I think it's appropriate to view these frightening organizations in the context of maintaining that kind of instability rather than viewing them as people that we want to get rid of. If they all went away tomorrow, I think the U.S. policy would be screwed.
Well, we do know some things about the two drone programs. There's a military program and there's a CIA program. And John Brennan, who was the counterterrorism czar who became head of the CIA, was very instrumental in encouraging, apparently, look, Obama had it, I don't know how this stuff works. They run the stuff, we're just under them. But obviously he had a choice to go more towards this method of warfighting, and there was a lot coming out of the military that had to do with, we've got this capability now, we need to be using it, right? They had napalm in the 60s. A lot of us, I'm looking around, we got active because LBJ was dropping napalm on babies, and we saw those photos, right? Because, right? This was a pivotal thing, and I think drones for this generation could be one of those instances.
But this is not to excuse his doing it.
I know you're not.
Where does it come?
Look, they're trying to run a global empire, and they're realizing that the occupations were a big failure for the most part. They're looking for a more sophisticated way of controlling large sections of the globe. And, everybody says they're shifting more towards Africa now. Now they have done a drone strike in Africa that Ed mentioned, 150 people, a country the U.S. is not at war with. This, and they are, as I mentioned, bringing more officers of color into the U.S. military. They're aiming towards other parts of the world for control without having to send a lot of people there, and I think that's why drones are attractive.
Nick, you're also going to respond.
Yeah, in terms of Honeywell, for an example, it's a major corporation that has 129,000 some employees, most of them outside the United States. They make equipment for oil and gas drilling companies. They make the assemblies for nuclear weapons. They make drone motors, many other military parts. They sell thermostats, controls for heating and cooling. And in their annual filing with the SEC, they list different conditions that might affect their profitability. But one of the things that's very interesting is there's a whole paragraph that says we need to have the following in other countries in order to maintain and advance ourselves. Economic, political stability, and then they go through security, So when I think you're in the White House, you know in every country a list of the corporations there and ones that want to be there. When Obama goes on this trip, he will have a briefing book about these corporations want to be in the following places in the Pacific. These are specific business interests that we have in Vietnam, as well as, you know, the military interest. So when it comes to deciding on a drone strike or who is a disruptive power or force or individual in a country, I think it's within that complex of information about what powers are interested in that country. So his job is really to pull the trigger for those people that he feels a servant of. But I just want to mention something about fear. Yes, okay. I think that when a person takes on a job like that, they know they're going to be afraid. And they have to make a decision about how obedient to their fears they're going to be, or is there going to be courage employed. And so I think that's true for every one of us. To say, by speaking out, I'm not going to be afraid. Yeah, probably you would be afraid, but it doesn't mean you have to obey the fear. And I think that's what it comes down to. And this gentleman speaking to us, how many of us will obey our fear or pray instead, right? Or whatever we do to deal with our fears in a healthy way. And the religious community of the United States is abysmal failure in helping the people of this country to know how to deal with their fears of these terror people. So what we're trying to do is talk in the middle of that kind of spiritual, educational failure to give people some frame of reference, and it's pretty hard to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to respond, at one level, yeah, the drones are hyped as keeping, you know, our boys and girls safe, you know, keeping boots off the ground. But in fact, what drones are doing is getting the U.S. involved in any number of conflicts, generating those conflicts, which who knows what that'll lead to in terms of, you know, killing our own forces, perhaps down the line a bit.
How do you all respond to the argument that drones are a legitimate weapon of warfare, and the problem is not with armed drones per se, but rather with the way that drones are currently being deployed by the CIA and the Pentagon? Yes.
Well, I would say that the drone is a very unusual weapon because as soon as you say, I'm going to do surveillance, already you're saying there are targets. And so I put it on the same category as poison gas. where it drifts wherever it will. And as soon as you start doing surveillance, you will inevitably start doing killing, regardless of the legitimacy of it. And so that to me makes it a weapon that's totally off limits for human beings to be using, to be around, because the temptations are too great.
The NRA argues that guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, that applies directly to drones. Drones are a form of guns. But the reality is, if there weren't, in the US, any number of different gun manufacturers making profit from the distribution of guns, there would be a lot fewer murders in this country.
I would just go to the, look, since I'm sitting on your left, I'm going to say this whole system is illegitimate. And the idea of an air force, a country that has an air force that can go kill other countries, we want to do away with this. The Revolutionary Communist Party put out a constitution for a new socialist republic. What it says is we will not have nuclear weapons. I really applaud that. Here's a country that's basing its might makes right around the whole world on the first use of nuclear weapons, and having the nerve to say what other countries can have nuclear weapons. Now 50 countries have drones. Number 2 country to have drones is what? Israel, a completely illegitimate state. I really think we should, this is not legitimate. I understand that in legal terms, you have different constraints, but for humanity, it's not legitimate to have weapons that can kill like this. It's not needed. It's only needed because we have this system that's got to control people and territory and makes everything into a commodity.